where we are with respect to the Canadian Action Plan. And so, Aline, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I do want to thank the National Farm Animal Health and Welfare Council for organizing this webinar this afternoon. I think it is an excellent opportunity to provide you with an update in terms of what's happening with the antimicrobial resistance file, and for us to look at the results of the work that has been done by the Council, which is an important piece to the puzzle that is our way forward in terms of addressing antimicrobial resistance. So if they can just have the next slide, please. So, okay. So antimicrobial resistance is a major challenge. It is not a small issue to deal with. It knows no boundary, and it certainly does not know a delineation between human health and animal health. And so it is always important to remember that antimicrobial resistance can only find a solution if we all work together across the board in a One Health way in order to address it. But what is antimicrobial resistance? And I know many people know that, but really at the end of the day, what it is the development of resistance to antimicrobials, which are antibiotics or antifungal, etc. And the reason this is really critical is that if we are no longer able to use antibiotics, for instance, that we use to treat humans, then we are facing some significant long-term challenges. And so the goal of trying to address the antimicrobial resistance challenge is really to try and extend for as long as possible those antimicrobials that we already have. And yes, we often think about it as antimicrobials for humans, but we all have to work together to address this complex issue, and we need to have a coordinated action across the entire spectrum, both private and public. We have to look at it from an environment lens, an animal lens, and a human lens. And so the work that has already been done by many players in the animal health sector is greatly welcomed because it is the contribution to trying to address the challenge. One of the things we need to remember is, as I said, AMR knows no boundaries. So this is not just a Canadian problem. This is an international problem, and we are working internationally to try to address it with as many counterparts as possible. May I have the next slide, please? So when we look at the current international landscape, we find that there are many different fora working on AMR. We have the Global Action Plan, which is international in nature at the WHO level. We have OIE, which is of a direct interest to us in the animal health world. We have the FAO Action Plan. And the reality is, as these plans were developed, the realization came that they cannot be independent and they have to work together. So even internationally, there's now what we call a tripartite body composed of the WHO, the OIE, and the FAO to try and make sure that we are working hand in hand, that we are trying to address the problem in a consistent way across the entire chain. And so these international documents both inspire what we do in Canada, but also it is our opportunity to influence the international framework. May I have the next slide, please? From a Canadian perspective, we have been trying to address the AMR problem for a number of years. In fact, when I first started on this file, the first thing that really struck me is that many people 40, 50, 60 years ago, as soon as we had antibiotics, started raising the flag that if we did not use them judiciously, if we were not using them the right way, that we could in fact lose their effectiveness because resistance will be developing. So the knowledge of resistance is not a new one, but how do we tackle it? How do we make sure that we decrease the resistance? How do we make sure that we are trying to extend the life of those antimicrobials? It's an effort that has been happening over the last number of years. In Canada specifically, in October 2014, we released a federal framework for action. And in that federal framework, we had three key pillars. We had surveillance, we had stewardship, and we had research and innovation. When we talked about surveillance, we talked both of surveillance of the resistance, but also surveillance around use, understanding what the patterns are. However, all of that cannot really yield any results if you do not use this knowledge in order to apply it in how you make choices in using antimicrobials, and this is the stewardship. And finally, research and innovation came to underpin everything, because not only do we talk about research and innovation as new antimicrobials in the animal health world, we talk a lot about alternatives, but it's also about tools that we can use within surveillance and stewardship to advance the cause. But the very big thing in the federal framework is the realization, obviously, that we could not do it on our own, because this problem cannot be solved by one partner or one player. We all have to work together. And so we moved forward with the release of a pan-Canadian framework in 2017, after we've developed our federal action plan to help us move forward and have markers. We released in September 2017 a pan-Canadian framework. That pan-Canadian framework added actually a fourth pillar, and that is the infection prevention pillar. And so we came to the realization that we needed to bolster infection prevention, because if we are able to prevent the infection component, then the likelihood for us to use antimicrobials goes down, and so on and so forth. So you can see the logic behind it. This particular framework was developed with the help of the provincial territories, the different federal governments, with our industry counterparts, as well as academic colleagues. And the idea was we needed to look under each one of those pillars, the three that I first mentioned, plus infection prevention, in order to look at the big picture and work together in a One Health approach, so both human health and animal health, to be able to put forward what is our vision in addressing antimicrobial resistance and use under the four pillars of, again, surveillance, stewardship, infection prevention, and research and innovation. So today, we are getting ready to have a pan-Canadian action plan, because frameworks are good, but frameworks give us a direction. The question is, what are we going to specifically do as a country? Not as a federal government, not as an industry group, but really as a country. And so if I could have the next slide, please. So one of the things that we needed to remember before we delved into what we wanted to do as a country, we needed to make sure that we also understood what was happening internationally. And so in parallel to developing our own internal documents and plans, and right now we're developing the action plan, we worked really closely in terms of harmonized response internationally. And you have a list of those that we have collaborated with, but this is just one group. There's actually many, many more. And in fact, every single international forum you can think of has actually touched the topic of AMR, AMU. So this is just a little sample of those that we've worked with internationally to try to create harmonization, because an internal and national action plan can only go so far if there's no international resonance, and so we have to have those two tracks going in parallel. Megan, may I have the next slide, please? So coming back to our Canadian soil, how do we go about developing a pan-Canadian action plan? It is in fact a daunting task, but it is a necessary task, and I have to say that it is really nice to see how all the different players, both on the human health side and the animal health side, have been coming together. And so the process that you see laid before you is the one that we have decided to undertake in order to develop the pan-Canadian action plan. We started by analyzing data that we had collected from the framework to give us an initial sense of what might the gaps be. We then did some very significant engagement. In the agricultural sector, we've actually done a lot of bilateral engagement so that we could truly understand what has been happening in each of the parts of the sector, so we can get a good sense of the amount of work that's out there and what are really the gaps and what more can we do. We then moved on into the development phase, where we again used the concept of task groups that took all this input and in fact undertook a number of workshops to be able to start populating the action plan from all the input that's received. Where we are today is we're getting closer to a draft action plan. We still have an engagement to be completed online in the May period, and then we'll move into a bit of a review approach to ensure that that plan, that draft action plan, can be supported by folks, and that it does reflect the conversation leading us into an approval phase, which we can anticipate to happen in the summer. However, there are other considerations, but that is the plan for now, is to move for approvals in the summer. So if I could have the next slide, please. So when we looked back on what we had gleaned from the framework consultations and engagements, as well as what we called the One Health Roundtable, which is the kickoff meeting for the Pan-Canadian Action Plan, it became very clear that there are specific gaps that we could already see. It didn't mean we had all the answers, but we knew already that from the data, maybe we needed a national information hub. The fact that CPART on the agricultural side for us was an absolute cornerstone of antimicrobial resistance surveillance. We also needed to better understand how risk assessments were done, and how did they guide action. And so we certainly brought that into the thinking as the Pan-Canadian Action Plan was being developed. Raising awareness was another one. A big gap around how do we make sure that the consistent data is being received, but more beyond that, how is that data being used? And so how do we communicate the information, not just within sectors, but to the public? Stewardship, obviously, one very important piece of work, because we could have all the information in the world and the best intentions, but if those intentions are not translated into actions at the decision-making point, then obviously we would not be successful. And finally, the enabling innovation was really critical, particularly the fact that we needed more alternatives in the space of agriculture in particular. But also there was a sense that we needed to better understand the regulatory barriers in order for us to be able to overcome them and therefore facilitate the uptake of innovation. If I could have the next slide. So I did mention that we did a lot of bilateral engagement in the last several months around the Pan-Canadian Action Plan. I will spare you the reading of all the names, but all that to say that it was a cross-country effort. It included universities, industry, as well as provinces and territories. If I could have the next slide, please. And so what you will see is that through the little pie chart, it gives you a bit of a distribution of the people that we engaged with. For those of you who are familiar with the value chain roundtables, we also had a number of meetings with the different value chain roundtables, and we really wanted to ensure that we'd heard from everyone, that we are able to truly understand from an agricultural perspective what were the challenges, but also what was already out there being done. And it is, I think, in that context that the work that the Council has done around stewardship is particularly interesting, because things were able to be brought into a central place. I will pause here for a second to say that the human health side has also done their own engagement and consultation, and that we work very closely with them at the federal level. So for instance, I have regular meetings with them to make sure that we maintain the One Health, recognizing that there are different spaces in the One Health and that there are certain uniquenesses, and we wanted through the engagement process to account for that. The engagement was incredible. The first thing I do want to acknowledge is that there's a lot being done in the agricultural sector. Everybody is seized by the issue, and that there is significant support to continuing in developing a Pan-Canadian Action Plan and actually putting forward concrete actions that can help us continue to move forward. There was also a lot of reaffirmation of the key areas that needed action. So everything around data management, around the access to veterinarians across the country, around the sharing of best practices, the alternatives. So none of these are new things, but what was really good for us as we went through the engagement process was to hear validation of those areas, which meant that once we put them in the Pan-Canadian Action Plan, they would not be a surprise. If I could have the next slide, please. So really, when we look at what has happened up till now, I would say that the key message we heard is let's build on actions that are using existing initiatives. So let's not recreate the wheel. And again, this is where the work that the council did comes in very handy, because now we have a bit of a sense of the scope and where can things be built on as opposed to recreate it. There was a great sense that there's a strategic direction that needs to be identified so that all the common goals can come together, become tangible, and linked to a backbone. And that the One Health approach was key because we could do a lot on the animal health side, but if we didn't have a counterweight on the human health side or vice versa, then we would be missing an opportunity to, in fact, strengthen each other's actions because of the level of interconnectedness. But that wasn't just between human and animal, it was also the interconnectedness between the pillars, because again, you may have new tools under research and innovation that can help surveillance helps stewardship decisions and infection prevention. So really everything is artificially separated so that we can manage it, but it's all really connected, and we can never forget that. May I have the next slide, please? So obviously we all have been building towards a common vision for the Pan-Canadian Action Plan and Canada's action in general. What I would really like to highlight is that over the last few years, we have seen a really nice shift from finger pointing from human health to animal health, or vice versa, to truly a collaborative approach where everybody works together and is truly trying to move forward and putting forward critical actions to combat the spread of AMR. And that is a wonderful step forward when we think of the vision of where we want to get to. The concept of investments is very important. Investments can be done in many different forms. And so we need to make sure that when we are thinking about what we can all contribute to the issue of antimicrobial resistance, that it's not just all about money, it can be about strategic thinking, it can be about making choices as to where you focus your efforts. And finally, I would say that elaborating a domestic action plan is absolutely critical, but we cannot lose sight of the international component. And that international component, I would submit, is not just a government action. It is, again, something that we all as partners in dealing with this issue have to work together. And so we need to all, when we are on the international scene, to carry forward the message of the importance of combating AMR while being mindful that we already have a lot of work done and we need to continue to build on it so that we continue to be successful, not just nationally, but internationally as well. So I think this is the last slide. Megan, if you can try to go to the next one. I think that was the last one. So thank you very much, everyone. Just a quick reminder that the action plan is still being drafted, and our intent is to consult widely on it, sometimes in May through an electronic consultation process. And then after that, we'll have to integrate what we hear from folks, and we'll be able to figure out how we come back to the table to share the thinking at that point in time. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Aline. And once again, that was Dr. Aline Dimitri. She is the Executive Director of Animal Health for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Next up, I'd like to introduce Stephen Sternthal. He is the Director General for the Centre for Foodborne Environmental and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases from the Public Health Agency of Canada, as well as the Chair for our Antimicrobial Use and Resistance Committee for the National Farm Animal Health and Welfare Council. So Stephen, if you're ready, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Megan, you can hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Terrific. Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone. Merci à tous for coming this afternoon, Eastern Time, 3 o'clock, to spend the rest of this hour to talk about the important work that Council has been doing. I've been a member of the National Farm Animal Health and Welfare Council now since 2013. and I've had the pleasure of seeing Council's work evolve, seeing the pleasure of the sector's work evolve in the area of antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial use. This is Council's third report, 2014, 2016, and now 2019, that I'm sharing with you the highlights this afternoon. Next slide, please. So in 2016, the Council developed a number of recommendations, being aware that the Pan-Canadian framework was in development, being aware of many of the international developments, some of which Lynn Dimitri referenced this afternoon, and building on its 2014 recommendations, developed 15 recommendations for consideration by stakeholders at large. And for those that know the Council and the Council's work, it takes a very holistic approach to looking at issues. It looks at both government, regulatory, and other responsibilities and mandates. It looks at industry, of course, takes into consideration the role that academia and others can play as well. And overall, Council's 15 recommendations were made in 2016, and the report that we've circulated tries to present a snapshot of the kind of progress that we have seen, and quite significant progress, since 2016 in the area of AMR and AMU. In terms of this particular slide, it does highlight that one of the areas that was of interest to the Council at the time and remains an interest and hot topic for those involved, certainly in industry, is the regulatory system that we have in place. And obviously there have been some very recent advancements in the regulatory framework for antimicrobials around own use, importation of active pharmaceutical ingredients. So we consider that this recommendation that we were highlighting in 2016 had been completed. Next slide, please. Another number of the recommendations, about 8 recommendations, we looked at, and in our report we highlight the type of progress that we have seen with regards to moving forward on these recommendations. We've seen certainly significant engagement and furthering of the development of a Pan-Canadian framework, and now we are seeing work progressing nicely with regards to Pan-Canadian Action Plan. We've seen a greater environment of collaboration among stakeholders and regulators, and we've seen a number of new tools, new communication opportunities where various stakeholders have reached out very broadly within the sector and are engaging with veterinarians, with producers, with industry, with government officials to move forward on important areas of antimicrobial stewardship. And we've seen some good movement forward with regards to on-farm food safety programs incorporating antimicrobial stewardship practices as well. Next slide. So, of course, not all of our recommendations did the Council expect to be completed even within such a short time. When we made those recommendations in 2016, we certainly have seen, for example, in the area of surveillance, we have seen good foundational work. I'm a bit biased because the CPARS program is part of my responsibility here in the Public Health Agency of Canada. But essentially, we certainly have seen continued collaboration, continued data sharing, and continued uptake of the data with regards to stewardship practices, and are hopeful that we can go forward into the future with an even more robust data set, as well as informing future stewardship approaches. And although we have made good progress in our regulatory framework, there certainly still is work that can be done to go ahead and move forward on alternatives to antimicrobials and other aspects that are still being worked on. Next slide, please. So a few of the recommendations require a bit further push from the Council's point of view over the next number of years. I think I've highlighted the last one in terms of continued work in terms of our regulatory frameworks. The third to last really looks at continuing to harmonize where possible and where it makes sense our Canadian regulatory framework with those of other of our trading partners, in particular the United States. Getting data on antimicrobial use at various levels, including the farm level at the level of individual veterinarians and practitioners, continues to be an area of ongoing discussion with the development of minimum data sets and now further discussions on how to realize those minimum data sets. There has been some work within specific commodity organizations, associations regarding continuing education, but it's something that we continue to see a need for, both within the context of providers, producers, and various service providers. Next slide. Okay, so I guess in the next few slides, I'm just going to give a few highlights, a few snapshots of some of the excellent work that's been initiated and underway across the sector. That by no means is comprehensive. When I was looking at our stewardship report just a few minutes ago, I noticed a number of the important national livestock associations that have been identified. But we recognize that this is a snapshot, although there has been even more work that's been accomplished in the sector, and our report highlights a good proportion of the work that we have seen. Move on to the next slide. So in Ontario, we see an excellent example of stewardship for those that are aware and have been part of or have seen in action. The amstewardship.ca, which is the Farmed Animal Antimicrobial Stewardship website. And again, this is an initiative that's aiming to tackle AMR through education, collaboration, and engagement across the value chain. And I think that's something that, building on Aline Dimitri's comments about working through the value chain roundtables, it's very important that we take a very holistic and a value chain approach to addressing AMR. Next slide. Certainly would be remiss to have a presentation and not include the excellent work done by colleagues in the chicken farmers of Canada in terms of their antimicrobial use reduction strategies. And they have certainly done quite a bit across the sector, beginning in 2014 by eliminating the preventative use of Category 1 antibiotics, subsequently moving on to eliminating the preventative use of Category 2 antibiotics by last year, with ultimately a goal of by 2020 of eliminating the preventative use of Category 3 antibiotics. For those that are aware of the categories, these are really from the regulatory framework, highlighting antimicrobials that are of importance to human health as well. So anything to do to reduce the use, particularly of antibiotics that are used in humans and in people, is certainly an important aspect of this work. We also have highlights of a number of provincial governments, certainly our consultations through the Council of Chief Veterinary Officers yielded some excellent examples where provinces are also picking up the charge. So in Prince Edward Island, there has been a focus on tools and education, the development of an antimicrobial resistance in agriculture website, and really on the front lines to develop and display biosecurity signage, to really raise awareness at the farm level, issues related to, for example, zoonotic diseases and AMR, etc. So really excellent initiatives within our provincial territorial colleagues. Next slide. So let's not forget our practitioners. We certainly have seen very active engagement in this work by the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association. They have done some work looking at the veterinary oversight for antimicrobial prescriptions across the country, looking more closely at their guidelines for veterinary antimicrobial use, as well as undertaking a number of workshops more recently to look at the opportunity to leverage veterinarians in AMU surveillance and going forward as well. So really, again, excellent engagement that we've seen as well by our practitioners. Next slide. So our colleagues from the Canadian Animal Health Institute have been actively engaged, as you can tell from this slide, for a very long time in contributing to antimicrobial stewardship. For the past 10 years, they've been providing on a voluntary basis the sales data for antimicrobials that are sold for use in animal agriculture to my colleagues in the Public Health Agency and CPARS for analysis and trying to line up with the types of resistance patterns that we've seen over the past 15 years in animal agriculture. But again, I think a number of really excellent examples where they have partnered both in advocacy and advice to the government in terms of the updating and changing of our regulatory frameworks as well. Next slide. Okay, well, where do we go from here? I mean, I guess I have the pleasure of following Lynn's presentation on the Pan-Canadian Action Plan. And what I would say is that all sectors, both human health sectors, the agri-food sectors, the animal health sectors, all have enough work to do going forward to address issues related to AMR and AMU. Clearly, there are some important aspects that we feel really underline and such an approach, and that is the need for ongoing collaboration and information sharing, the need for transparency and continued transparency in the work that everybody is doing, and the need to work across sectors so that where there's opportunities for working with human health, that we take advantage of those opportunities, and vice versa as well. And we need to support networks and mobilization of groups with common areas of interest around coordination and information sharing and fostering collaboration and stewardship. Next slide. So really, I'll leave you with again the context of why it's important to look at this issue sort of in a nationally coordinated way, in a harmonized way, and that's because it is complex. As Lynn mentioned earlier, it is an issue that we have some of the good data and good picture of what's going on, but we are missing elements of that picture. So we're continuing to work on that so we can not only inform stewardship, but also to evaluate and monitor how things are going with regards to stewardship initiatives. These things require human, financial expertise and resources to be able to get done. So stay tuned for more news and more in-kind contributions, as we like to say in the words of government. And really the need that this is not a one-time or a quick issue that can be resolved. This is really an issue that will continue to evolve over time, that will continue to have new players, new individuals enter the marketplace, new professionals practicing, new producers in the future, new academia joining these issues, and will continue to need to onboard and to bring forth a good cohesive plan moving into the future. Next slide. So that really is the end of the presentation that I have. Of course, if there are any questions, where I believe Megan will be willing to entertain them today for the rest of our webinar, you can certainly send us any comments or questions. Like I said, this is not the end. And as Lynn mentioned, this is certainly not the end of a process. This is really the opportunity for the council to thank the collaboration of everyone in the sector on pulling together such a report, taking stock of where we've made good progress together, and looking forward to working in the future on future collaboration. So Megan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So that concludes our formal presentation process. So I would like to ask if anybody has any questions. They can either unmute themselves and ask, or feel free to also type the questions into the chat function if you prefer. So any questions? seems to be a pretty quiet house today, Aline and Stephen. So I think certainly we can extend the offer to answer any questions and we can conclude if there's anything further to add.
This is Henry Seelan speaking. One question I have was that it was kind of the timeline that was presented in Arlene's presentation. How do we feel that we're going to be able to meet the timelines that were in that one slide? Completing at the end of the summer, is that a realistic timetable, and will we get there?
So it's Aline. We are certainly working towards that. We have put everything in place as federal enablers to make sure that the right conversations are happening so that we can meet that timeline. So right now we are very optimistic that we can in fact meet that timeline.
Great, thanks, Aline. Any other questions? Just a reminder to unmute yourself if you have any. All right, well, on behalf of the National Farm Animal Health and Welfare Council, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today, as well as to extend my appreciation to both Aline and Stephen for their time. The information was sincerely appreciated, and if there are any follow-up questions after the fact, feel free to contact myself or Aline and Stephen, and we'd be happy to follow up. So thank you everyone for joining today.